The sharp blade of the executioner's razor sliced through the morning air, a chill running through the crowd that had gathered to witness the grim spectacle. It was June 26, 1369, in the bustling city of Barcelona, and the air was thick with tension. Pere Antich, a man from Alela, stood bound and trembling, his fate sealed for the crime of blasphemy. His words, ugly and defiant, had insulted God and the Virgin Mary, and now he faced a punishment as severe as his crime. Prince John, the general governor, had decreed that Pere's tongue must be not only cut out, but also burned at his feet. The town crier's voice echoed through the square, announcing the sentence with a solemn finality. The crowd murmured, some in shock, others in grim satisfaction. The hangman, a figure cloaked in black, stepped forward with his instruments, a razor, a hook, and a bundle of firewood. The hangman's hands moved with practiced precision. He looped the noose around Pere's neck, securing it tightly. Then, with a swift, brutal motion, he cut out Pere's tongue. The crowd gasped as the executioner placed the bloody tongue on the ground and set it alight. The flames flickered, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Pere's body was then hoisted up, and the noose tightened, ending his life in a final, agonizing struggle. Across the city, in the ledger of the jurisdictional court, the costs were meticulously recorded: the razor, the firewood, the hangman's rope, and the labor of the executioners. Every detail was noted, a stark reminder of the gravity of the crime and the harshness of the punishment. But this was not an uncommon sight in medieval Barcelona. The city's records were filled with accounts of similar executions, each one a testament to the rigid enforcement of law and the deep-seated beliefs of the time. In 1357, a counterfeiter met a similar fate. His tools of the trade burned alongside him, symbolizing the destruction of his criminal activities. The town crier, often accompanied by the mournful sounds of trumpets, would announce the sentence, and the musicians would play, adding a somber melody to the grim proceedings. The gallows, a fixture in the city squares, stood as a stark reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. These gallows, often made of wood and sometimes stone, required regular maintenance. The ladders used to reach the noose were a common sight, often needing repair or replacement. Carpenters and laborers were paid to ensure the gallows were in working order, ready for the next execution. The process was methodical and ritualistic. Once the prisoner reached the gallows, they were given a final chance to confess their sins, a practice that had become increasingly important in the 15th century. The presence of a priest, holding a crucifix, was a common sight as the condemned sought absolution before their final moments. The ladder was then brought, and the prisoner climbed it, the noose tightening around their neck. The hangman's rope, a new one for each execution, was a crucial part of the ritual, and the cost of these ropes was carefully noted in the court's accounts. The execution itself was a public affair, designed to instill fear and obedience in the community. The crowd watched in silence as the hangman pushed the prisoner off the ladder, the noose doing its grim work. The body was left to hang, a stark warning to all who dared challenge the law. In the northern regions of Roussillon and Cerdagne, the executions had their own unique rituals. The condemned were often hooded, their faces hidden from the world as they faced their end. They were dressed in simple pants and shirts, provided by the court, a final act of control over their lives. The hoods, shirts, and pants were all items that had to be prepared in advance, the costs meticulously recorded in the court's ledgers. Each execution was a spectacle, a grim reminder of the power of the law and the consequences of defying it. The records of these events, with their detailed accounts and precise costs, paint a picture of a society where justice was swift and often brutal. The hangman's razor, the burning tongue, and the noose were instruments of a harsh and unforgiving justice, a justice that left an indelible mark on the city and its people. In the counties of Roussillon and Cerdagne, the court had a peculiar tradition of supplying the executioner with new gloves for each execution. These gloves, which cost around 10 to 12 pence, later rising to about 1.5 shillings, were simple, disposable items used for any corporal punishment, including the common practice of cutting off ears. The gloves were intended to prevent the executioner from touching the accused with his bare hands, a measure of moral and social hygiene. The idea was that if the executioner touched the condemned, he would be contaminated. This same concern applied to other marginal groups, such as Jews and prostitutes. who were also banned from touching products in the market with their bare hands. In Perpignan, these gloves helped executioners avoid the extreme discrimination faced by these groups. When more than one prisoner was executed, the executioner received 2 pairs of gloves, one for each execution. If the punishments were applied simultaneously, a single pair of gloves was enough, as they could be thrown away after use. The location of executions was carefully chosen, often far from church buildings to maintain moral hygiene. Influential figures like Francesc Aixaimes envisioned an ideal city where the cathedral stood at the center, free from any dishonorable or dirty elements, such as gallows or pillories. The city of Tortosa, for instance, legislated that corporal punishment could only be applied within the city itself, not in the surrounding area. This stipulation became a point of jurisdictional dispute, as seen in the conflict between the city council and the order of Knights Hospitaller over the preceptory of Ulldecona. The gallows were a symbol of jurisdiction, often leading to disputes over their placement. In 1318, a conflict arose in Vic because the 2 jurisdictions in the city were using the same gallows. Similarly, in the region of Roussillon and Cerdagne, the capital city of Perpignan often received appeals from other towns, leading to mistrust and jurisdictional disputes. For example, the local government of Puigcerdá, the capital of Cerdagne, often argued with Perpignan over the extradition of trials and prisoners. In 1375, a man accused of rustling sheep was taken to Perpignan, tried, and then returned to Puigcerdá for execution, highlighting the complex jurisdictional relationships. In the Vicariate of Roussillon, it was common to transfer condemned individuals to the capital, Perpignan, for execution. For instance, Pierre Mir, who committed murder in Bages, was taken to Perpignan, tortured, tried, and executed in 1389. These transfers sometimes had deeper jurisdictional implications, such as when a vagabond was taken from the episcopal city of Elna to Perpignan by order of the governor. The location of executions often reflected the desire to bring the condemned closer to their place of origin or the scene of the crime. In Barcelona, in 1358, prisoners were executed in the parish of Sant Andrew de Palomar because they were from that area. In 1395, a Maltese man who had robbed a notary on Montjuic was executed on the gallows there. This practice aimed to provide a moral lesson by linking the punishment to the crime. However, the primary criterion for choosing execution sites was their central and public location, where a large number of people could witness the punishment. In Barcelona, the gallows of the Porxo de la Mar Porch of the Sea were the most common site, used for about half of all executions in the 14th century. Other sites included the Placa del Blat Wheat Square, Montjuic, and various other public squares and gates. The gallows were often repaired or replaced to ensure they were always ready for use. In 1391, after the attack on the Jewish quarter, the city of Barcelona executed 11 people in prominent and intentional locations, such as the entrance to the Jewish neighborhood, to send a clear message. The gallows, placed in busy and visible areas, served as a constant reminder of the authorities' power and the consequences of breaking the law. In the bustling city of Barcelona during the late Middle Ages, the gallows, often located in prominent places like the Rambla and the Bequeria, played a significant role in the city's social and political life. These places of execution were not just sites where the condemned met their fate. They were symbols of power and justice, designed to instill fear and maintain order. During times of civil unrest, such as the Civil War that flared up in 1468, the gallows became even more significant. Prominent citizens accused of treason, like Francesc Sescorts and Bernat Estupiña, were executed beside the gallows in the Bequeria. Despite the presence of the gallows, the method of execution was often strangled, a practice that reflected the social status of the condemned. The location of the execution, however, remained crucial, as it combined the symbolic power of the central location with the public spectacle of punishment. As the city of Barcelona grew and evolved, the Rambla and the surrounding areas, including the Raval district, became more important. The gallows in these locations saw an increase in the number of executions, reflecting the changing dynamics of the city. The central placement of these execution sites was not accidental. They were chosen to maximize the impact of the punishment, to serve as a warning to others, and to demonstrate the power of the authorities. Executions were not always solitary events. In large public spaces, Multiple executions could take place at the same time, often involving accomplices in crimes. These collective executions were meant to be especially shocking and memorable, reinforcing the gravity of the offenses. For example, a 16th-century Valencian manuscript depicts 4 men hanging from the same gibbet, a vivid illustration of the public nature of these punishments. The gallows were the primary instrument of execution, but the method and location could vary depending on the crime and the status of the condemned. In some cases, the execution was carried out in the place where the crime was committed, as in the case of 2 men executed in an olive grove in 1399. The symbolism of the location was meant to add an extra layer of meaning to the punishment, making it more fitting and just. Executions were generally public affairs, designed to be seen and remembered. However, there were instances when the authorities chose to conduct executions in secret, often at night, to avoid public unrest. One such example occurred in 1444, when the governor of Catalonia, in a show of his power, ordered the hanging of 2 prisoners during the night without a trial by eminent citizens. This act was a clear demonstration of the governor's authority and the political tensions of the time. Not all executions took place in public squares. In times of heightened urban tensions, such as the St. Matthew's plot of 1462, former urban leaders were executed inside the prison, and their bodies were displayed publicly afterward. This practice of public display was a way to ensure that the punishment was both felt and seen, reinforcing the message of the authorities. The death penalty was sometimes adapted to the crime and the status of the accused. For example, in 1358, King Peter the Ceremonious ordered that Ramon Marque, a prominent citizen, be drowned at sea rather than hanged. This method of execution was chosen to respect Marque's social status, while still delivering a severe and symbolic punishment. The king's decision was a calculated move to maintain the delicate balance of power and honor within the city. Similarly, in 1261, Baron Ramon Guillem II of Odena was condemned to be thrown into the sea during a period of noble rebellion against the king. This punishment was designed to send a strong message to other nobles about the consequences of defying the monarch. The denial of a proper burial was a particularly harsh aspect of the sentence, as it implied that the condemned had no place in the afterlife, a serious concern in a deeply religious society. The display of the bodies of the executed continued the punishment beyond death. The shame and infamy associated with the execution were meant to linger, serving as a lasting reminder to the community. This practice was a powerful tool for maintaining social order and deterring future crimes. In this way, the gallows and the places of execution in Barcelona were more than just sites of punishment. They were symbols of the complex interplay of power, justice, and social control in the late Middle Ages. In the medieval Catalan region, the execution of criminals was a grim but meticulously documented process. The records from various archives provide a detailed account of the practices and expenses involved. The cost of materials and services, from the posts and stakes to the ropes and carts, were all carefully noted. One of the most common methods of execution was hanging. The posts used for hanging were often mentioned in the records, detailing their cost and the labor involved. For example, a post used to drag a man to the gallows was noted in the archives, along with the cost of the rope and the mule that dragged the condemned. The executioners and their assistants were paid for their services, including the man who carried the ladder to the gallows and the person who tied the noose. The execution process was often public, meant to serve as a deterrent. The records describe the procession of the condemned to the place of execution, often accompanied by a trumpeter and a crier who announced the sentence. The condemned were sometimes dragged through the streets on a cart, with their hands and feet tied. The gallows themselves were often located in prominent public places, such as market squares or near important buildings. In some cases, the condemned were required to wear specific clothing, or were stripped of their garments. For instance, one record mentions a man who was hanged without trousers or a shirt, while another describes the purchase of new clothes for a condemned man, including a shirt, trousers, and a hat. The clothing was meant to ensure a certain level of dignity, or to serve as a form of humiliation. The execution of women was particularly detailed. Women were sometimes hanged with their skirts, tied up to prevent them from exposing themselves. This was a common practice, as seen in a record from 1547 that noted the cost of ropes to tie the hands and skirts of a woman who was hanged for blasphemy. The records also shed light on the social and religious context of these executions. The condemned were often given the opportunity to confess their sins before being hanged. The church played a significant role, with priests sometimes accompanying the condemned to the gallows. The execution site itself was often a place of spiritual significance, and the records sometimes mentioned the presence of religious symbols, such as a crucifix. The gallows were not just places of execution, but also symbols of authority and justice. They were often constructed in specific locations within the city, and the placement was carefully chosen. For example, a record from 1547 mentions the construction of new gallows near a specific location called Low Carbo. The location of the gallows was meant to reinforce the power of the authorities and to serve as a warning to the public. The costs associated with executions were significant. They included the payment for the executioner, the materials used, and the labor involved. The records provide a detailed breakdown of these expenses, from the cost of the post and the rope to the payment for the mule and the ladder. The records also mention the cost of other materials, such as wood for burning, and the payment for the trumpeter and the crier. The archives also reveal the occasional use of more elaborate punishments, such as the dragging of the condemned through the streets on a cart or the amputation of limbs. In one case, a man's hand was cut off before he was hanged, and a chicken was placed on the hand as a form of ridicule. These punishments were meant to be particularly severe and to serve as a strong deterrent. The execution process in medieval Catalonia was a complex and well-documented affair, reflecting the social, religious, and legal norms of the time. The records provide a window into a world where justice was often harsh and public, and where the execution of criminals was a significant event in the life of the community. The practice of displaying the bodies of executed criminals was a vivid and terrifying spectacle that served as a public warning to deter others from committing similar offenses. King Peter the Ceremonious of Aragon articulated this in 1341, stating that the bodies of the wicked should be visible to all, emphasizing the public nature of the punishment. Perversorum exemplo debent cunctorum oculis publis subjacere. This practice was widespread across Europe, where bodies were often transferred from the central place of execution to locations outside the town, ensuring that travelers would see them as they passed by. In Périgueux, a town in France, the bodies were taken to Equernaboeuf, about 2 kilometers southwest of the town. This was a common practice, creating a macabre landscape along the paths, as depicted in many contemporary images. Sometimes the display was more specific, focusing on the site of the crime. For instance, in 1391, Huguet Meix's head was placed in the window he used to enter the house of notary Berenger Badork, where he had committed a crime. Along with his head, the tools he used, such as a rope ladder and a bar, were also displayed, emphasizing the gravity of his actions. In 1372, in Lleida, a deputy to the vicar and 2 city councillors went to the neighboring town of Almacelles during a period of tension. During a confrontation, one of the attackers was killed. The city council decided not to hang the dead man, but to place him on a pole at the site of the attack, making his crime widely known and serving as a stark example. They agree that this man who is already dead cannot be hung, but, given that he committed so huge and ugly a crime against the councillor, a pole must be fixed in the place where the wounds were done, and that he will be put in that pole to exemplify, and that it will be well known that he had committed this crime. The display of the dead, even in non-judicial cases, was meant to emphasize the severity of the crime and the power of the authorities. In 1457, in Barcelona, the city's urban militia was called out against Baron Pierre de Castelbel, who had led a group to abduct a notable woman. Despite his death and his status as a baron, his body was brought to Barcelona and displayed, though fragmented, at the portal New Gate of the city. This demonstrated the city's power and its commitment to protecting its leading citizens. King Peter the Ceremonious also used the display of executed bodies to assert his authority. After quelling the Union revolt in Saragossa and Valencia, he ordered the leaders' bodies to be exhibited in the main points of the city, emphasizing his control and the immediate consequences of rebellion. The bodies were typically displayed on the gallows outside the town, often a day after the execution. This was done by low-status individuals, usually hired for the task, and sometimes led by a jurisdictional official. In Manresa in 1447, a subvicar was accompanied by a carpenter to ensure the gallows were secure when transferring a thief's body. The costs for such tasks included new ropes and the labor of the hired men. In Barcelona, the task of transferring bodies was often given to Moors, who were paid for their services. By the late 14th century, the executioner in Barcelona had exclusive rights to this activity, receiving 22 shillings for each execution and 11 for the transfer of each body. Only in cases of illness would he delegate this work to others of low status, who received the same pay. These practices highlight the public and performative nature of medieval punishments, designed to instill fear and obedience in the community. The display of executed criminals served as a powerful reminder of the consequences of defying the law and the authority of the state.